If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Mid-Missouri used to be a bastion for the Democratic Party, especially places like Boone and Howard counties. But the Republicans have made great gains in that region over the years, a fact that Representative Chuck Basye knows very well. The Rocheport Republican joins us on the latest edition of Politically Speaking to talk about the GOP shift in his neck of the woods and some of the highlights of the 2019 legislative session. Let's hit the music.
This is Politically Speaking, the longest-running episodic podcast about Missouri politics.
It's a little complicated in Bolivar because there is a Parsons family there.
But we also knew that it was important to make sure that we got to where we needed to go.
You know, if you walk in a room and you're getting ready to make a decision and everybody in the room looks like you need to stop.
And right now what happens in the United States Senate is as critical as anywhere else in the country.
I really want the state to succeed.
Well, we want everybody to know that we're all working together.
I just worked hard to try to build my name where I didn't have the money.
And welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm Jason Rosenbaum, a political correspondent for St. Louis Public Radio. I'm in Jefferson City this afternoon with my special guest today.
And I'm State Representative Chuck Basye.
From the 47th House District.
That is correct.
It's an interestingly drawn House District that includes, it includes Boone, Randolph, Howard, and Cooper counties.
That's
is that correct?
Yes, Jason.
And if you could give people the general gist of the geography of that would be my first question.
Well, it's northwest Boone County, including the northwest, roughly 20% of Columbia. And in extreme northern Cooper County, eastern third of Howard County, and southeastern Randolph County. So it's got a lot of rural component to it, but most of the voters are in Boone County and in the Columbia portion.
Have you ever wondered what the appellate judges were thinking when they drew the district? Because it is a very strangely drawn district.
It is, but it is what it is, and but it is a pleasure serving in this capacity, and I've got to know an awful lot of people, some that like me and some that don't like me. But I think it's important to represent everybody. That's what I'm there for. And so I try to listen to people that don't agree with me politically and just do the best I can.
We'll get into the political dynamics of Mid-Missouri in a moment. But before we do, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, how you got involved in Mid-Missouri politics, anything you would like the listeners to know about Chuck Basye.
Well, I grew up in the St. Louis area, went to high school, joined the military, and when I got out of the military, I was hired by the FAA right after the controller strike when Ronald Reagan fired the controllers. And so I ended up in Kansas City for a couple of years working for the FAA, and then I was transferred to Columbia, and that's where I spent the bulk of my career at the Columbia Airport. So as I mentioned earlier, it's a long story, but I was eligible for early retirement. I was looking for something else to do, and I ran into a gentleman that was trying to find a candidate to run against the incumbent at that time, and I decided to go ahead and retire and run for office, and that's kind of how I got into the political side of it.
The person you were referring to is former State Representative John Wright, who had won in 2012 in a I'm going to describe it as a wacky contest, because it wasn't wacky for him. He was unopposed, or he was not unopposed in the primary. It was actually a very bitter primary between him and Nancy Copenhaver, former state rep. But the problem for the Republicans was somebody ran in the primary, dropped out, and they had to go through like 2 or 3 candidates before they got Mitch Richards in there.
Yeah, that's correct.
And it was still a pretty close race, even though Wright spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of his own money to eventually win that race.
Right. Yeah, it was very competitive. It's a district that's essentially split right down the middle, politically. And so I remember I met Mitch Richards a few times, and again, I think it kind of hurt him when he got in late, but that's what happened, and it's history there.
So in 2014, I think it was a little bit easier. I think you did have a primary, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I did. It was a lady that I know very well. She got in it for reasons, not because she didn't like me, but she felt compelled to get in, and So, but it was not contentious at all. We still get along. We're still friends, and probably always will be.
So the race between you and Representative Wright had to be one of the most expensive state rep races of 2014.
Yeah, it was. It was very expensive, and granted, I would not be successful. It wasn't for help from a lot of other state reps and other officials. Being a novice in politics at the time, it took a lot of quick learning, and I just worked real hard, and I knocked on a lot of doors, and so it took a lot of hard work. But being that I was newly retired, I had time to do that, and it ended up being successful.
Do you think that, especially since 2012, that parts of your district have moved more to the Republican side? Because you mentioned before we press record that your reelection in 2016 was competitive, but your reelection in 2018 was not terribly close. And I have to imagine that was because a lot of the areas that used to be very Democratic, and that includes places like Howard and parts of Boone, have shifted way to the Republican side. Is that what you've found just going door to door as well?
Pretty much. I still run into people that still consider themselves to be Democrats. However, they feel that that the party, especially on a national level, has changed so much that they no longer can support what the national party stands for. Whether that's true or not, that's what I was told by quite a few people. One being my cousin up in Higbee. He was a lifelong Democrat. He told me after my first election, I was only the second Republican he ever voted for in his whole life. And not really crazy about the first one. It was Richard Nixon, but that was the other Republican he voted for.
Well, congratulations on that distinction.
Yeah, but and I don't know if being cousins had anything to do with it, but he I think he votes mainly Republican now because he just didn't like some of the things that some of the national Democrats were standing for.
So let's talk about some of the things that happened in the 2019 session. You are the chairman of the House Veterans Committee, and you're
Correct.
also the vice chairman of the Elementary and Secondary Committee.
That is correct.
So a lot of the topics we're going to talk about are going to fall within those two policy realms. So let's talk about the Veterans Committee first. You were mentioning before we pressed record that there was a pretty multifaceted bill that dealt with military education that ended up being signed by Governor Mike Parson earlier this week. I want you to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. The bill that I was able to attach onto that was kind of an addition to something that passed 4 years ago, and it's the Returning Heroes Act. The original bill was for undergraduate education, and I added a new component to that will allow combat veterans to receive discounted tuition at Missouri public universities. And I think that's very, very important to try and help our veterans, especially our combat veterans, because they have been through some horrific things and a lot of things going on there, but mental health issues and some, a lot of other things. Multiple deployments takes a toll on them, and I think anything we can do to help them readjust back to a somewhat normal lifestyle, I think we should try to do.
Were they not able to get discounted tuition before this bill?
Well, they have the GI Bill, but I used mine when I got out of the military, but it doesn't cover everything. And unlike the one I had access to, today's GI Bill, you can transfer that to your family members, either your spouse or your children. So I thought that if we could give these vets a little bit of a help with some tuition assistance, they might be able to transfer their remaining benefits to one of their kids or maybe even their wife.
Yeah, I imagine that wasn't terribly controversial.
No, we had some pushback from higher education, but we worked real hard with them, and we made some amendments to the bill, and everybody ended up in support of the bill at the end. So
the other bill that has more to do with health care that you were sponsoring deals with expanding the autism mandate to include other developmental disabilities. Now, before we start talking about this topic, as I did with Senator Hoskins when we talked about it, for full disclosure, one of my children does have a developmental disability that does include treatment that I get through insurance. So this is not something that I am unaffected by, but it's an important enough issue that I feel like I shouldn't just not talk about it because it affects me. In fact, I don't feel like a lot of people talk about disability policy just because it's kind of under the radar. Tell me a little bit about what you were trying to do here and what the problem was that you were trying to solve.
Well, I don't have anybody in my family with a developmental disability to begin with, but I met this woman that had a son. It was her middle son. He is diagnosed with what they call a genetic disorder. That there's really no name for what this young man has afflicted with. But the more I learned from this woman, her frustrations with her insurance coverage, they have very good insurance. Her husband works for Columbia College. But like many insurance plans have a limit on the number of therapies you can have in a year. So in her case, and in my case with my insurance, it's 20. And it doesn't matter what kind of therapy it is, it all goes into the same bucket of 20. So in their instance, they would be out of pocket very early in the year. And and it's very expensive. This young man needs 2 to 3 different types of therapies a week. And so I thought, this is something that really we should look at and try to fix. So it was a long process. We had a lot of opposition at the beginning because of fear of escalating costs.
I was just going to say, I remember when the autism insurance mandate was going to the legislature, it took a long time.
Right.
Because I would think that insurance companies were not thrilled about being required to cover some of these treatments, which are probably very expensive. And I could just imagine that would be a natural opposition there.
Right. That was part of our problem. We had a hard time defining the number of individuals this was going to affect. So what we did was we found out that the numbers that the insurance companies were being given were included people that were not really in this population. They were including kids with learning disabilities, kids in Medicaid population, and then things like that. So once we eliminated those numbers out, we had some help from some different types of groups. The Missouri Developmental Disabilities Council was very, very helpful, as was the Department of Education in Missouri. So we once we got the numbers down, the insurance companies kind of softened their opposition to it, and at the end we ended up having zero opposition to the bill. So that was very, very huge. And then another thing that really helped, we have some very prominent statewide officials that have some children with developmental disabilities, and so I think the insurance lobby knew this was not going to go away, and I'm going to keep pushing it, or was going to push it until I was no longer in office. I just think it's the right thing to do, because there is no doubt, no dispute that once a child gets into a consistent therapy program, the better off they are in the long run. And so that I just felt very strongly that we should try to help these kids get into a consistent therapy program. And if I could just say real quick, this young man that I got to meet through his mother, Nathan, when I first met him, he could only speak 1, maybe 2 words. He could say yes, no, hi, thank you, that kind of thing. Now he's speaking after he's been in a good, consistent speech therapy program. Now he can speak in sentences. He's still a little hard to understand, but you can see that therapy is working for this young fellow. So I had a lot of help from a lot of people, and a lot of my colleagues were very helpful getting this passed as well.
The thing that I talked with Senator Hoskins about is there's no question that having mandated insurance like this is very helpful for people, whether you're lower income, middle income, whatever, because these treatments are very expensive. And without insurance, my son I'd be paying tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket, for example.
Well, yeah, if you didn't qualify for Medicaid, absolutely, it's very expensive. And a lot of people, if they can't afford the therapies, they just don't do it. And they just try to do without. And that doesn't help the situation at all.
But the question I would have is, if you do mandate some treatments and there aren't enough providers to provide that treatment, is the mandated coverage actually going to be that helpful to ordinary people?
Well, we'll have to wait and see. I hope that is not the case, but a lot of the groups that represent the different types of therapists, they were on board with this legislation from the beginning. So hopefully this might maybe create some jobs or some opportunities for people to move into some smaller rural areas if they have a client base that they can help out.
That was going to be my next question. As someone who represents a primarily rural area, have you found that having not only developmental therapists privately, but also special education teachers in some of the more rural schools, is it hard to attract people, especially when they may go to St. Louis or Kansas City where there are wealthier school districts, so there's more people to treat? Because from talking with other legislators about this, I often talk about the funding disparity in special education between St. Louis and St. Louis County. But I've also found that in rural parts of Missouri, it's also a huge problem attracting personnel to help people with physical and developmental disabilities.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely definitely an issue. And as a matter of fact, many of these families that have been behind me on this bill that have children that have a disability moved to Columbia for that very reason, because they couldn't get the services in the smaller communities or where they were living before they moved to Columbia. So that is an issue, but I don't know what we can do about it. But we just need to keep working and try and do the best we can for these kids that, through no fault of their own, they were just happened to be born with a disability. But I know one thing, a lot of these kids, all of them, there's not a thing wrong with their heart. They all just want to live and be happy. And I'm very thankful that the governor is going to sign this bill.
Is there anything that you think the legislature can do to maybe assist school districts with funding to hire special education teachers, or maybe have like a statewide solution that would go to maybe urban schools that are underperforming, but also rural schools that just don't have the tax base to hire special education teachers? And the reason I mention as a state solution is I'm kind of putting myself in the shoes of like a special education teacher. You spend a lot of money and you go through a lot of training in order to deal with kids with autism or epilepsy or cerebral palsy. And my guess would be that they may be more attracted to going to schools that would pay them more money, first of all, but also in a rural area with fewer kids, especially when they can't be paid as much money as a suburban school in St. Louis or Kansas City. I just may seem like you need the state to step in to fill in the gap where the local areas can't do that. Has that ever been something that's been discussed by legislators? Or is it just a local sort of thing?
Yeah, I think it might be more of a local thing, but it's certainly something that I would be more than happy to look at. I think that anything we can do to help people in general is a good thing, but this is something that's kind of become near and dear to me now that I've gotten to know a lot of these families and these kids. It's become very important to me. I want to do more, and I intend on working with these mothers. We're going to look at another issue that we're going to try and tackle next session. So a lot of work to be done, and I'm happy to be one to try and help them.
Another issue that you sponsored, although somebody else carried across the finish line, was pushing the start of school back, I think a week or something like that.
Yeah, it's the original bill was no more than 10 days before the first Monday in September, and it was amended to 14 days. And what the amendment did, it was actually an amendment offered by a former superintendent that represents the Sedalia area where the state fair is. The 14-day, the way it works out is school will never be able to start until the state fair is finished. So I thought it was a good compromise, and I had a lot of parents and teachers in my district, especially in the rural districts, that were frustrated that school starts earlier and earlier every year. And so it's something that I thought that I would give a shot. And the other reason I got behind it is one of my former colleagues, Jay Houghton, had a passion behind this issue because his son was involved in high school sports and showing animals at the state fair, and it was a big hardship on him. Mm-hmm. So Jay couldn't get it through, and I thought I'd just take up that on Jay's behalf and try and get it done. So
it did end up passing. You weren't the main handler of it, but since you did sponsor some similar element of it, were you surprised it actually passed? Because I'm reading a lot of articles now of school personnel not being super happy about this, but I'm sure that, as you mentioned, there are some parents with obligations in the summer that you mentioned that probably are happy about it. Like, what's been the reaction that you've heard after this passed?
Yeah, some of the school administrators and school board people are not happy with the legislation, but being that it was a big hit on, school starting earlier and earlier, it was very problematic for our tourism industry, especially the ones around the lake area and the floating, the river canoe people. And again, the state fair, it was their attendance has been declining over the years, and with kids having to be back home and start school earlier, it's hard for the kids to show their animals and their hard work and things like that. So I just thought it was a good bill, and I'm happy to be part of it.
That was going to be my next question, because when I'm reading a lot of the coverage of this, the people that are most happy about it are Lake of the Ozarks, the Branson area, places that have a lot of tourism, places where a lot of Missourians go for the summer. And I guess derisively, some of the opponents of this are saying, well, this is just meant as a sop to cities with a lot of tourism at the expense of flexibility of school districts. So how would you respond to that, I guess, criticism of this?
Well, again, we made a pretty significant compromise on the language of the bill. We changed it from 10 to 14 days. And, that schools still can, in some instances, start towards the mid part of August. But I understand the local control concept of that. That's what I heard a lot from especially the school board people. But if you look at the totality of it from the whole state perspective and the hit on the state fair and agriculture and agricultural education and also the tourism industry, I thought it was something we should address, because the example I used a lot was the Columbia School District. 15 years ago, they started on the 28th of August. This year, they're starting on the 14th, and it just seems like every year it got a day or two earlier. I know a lot of people that are very happy with the change.
Did you hear from any parents who are now like, whoa, school's starting a week later and day camp has ended before then? Now I have to be with my kids for another week. I'm horrified by this. Have you heard anything about that? Or
No, I have not.
Okay.
I absolutely have not.
We'll be back after this short break with Representative Chuck Basye.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
And we're back with Representative Chuck Basye. Another issue I wanted to talk about was something that I was widely seen as one of the marquee accomplishments of the 2019 session, and that is the bonding plan for bridges. And there ended up being a lot of legislative haggling over this, and the compromise that came out of some filibustering and negotiation in the Senate was that the bonding plan was kind of predicated on getting a federal grant primarily for the Rocheport Bridge, which is in your district. So this became kind of, and if this ends up, ends up getting the federal funds, then it would be a pretty wide, like a statewide impact of this. But it seems like because there's so much pressure to get this grant, it seems like your district is ground zero to make sure that this statewide plan happens. So talk to me a little bit about how you feel about how the bonding plan shook out and why you think replacing the Rocheport Bridge is so important, and also just explaining maybe some of the deficiencies with that.
Well, sure. The bridge itself is right in my district, but it affects all of mid-Missouri, actually the whole state, because it would be a I-70 type problem. So it would affect Columbia heavily, and then also the surrounding communities were very, very concerned about the traffic being diverted off of I-70. And for example, it would go right from Midway through Booneville, and the people in Booneville were just scared to death that they'd have all this massive traffic coming through and clogging up their business district. And so it would be a significant hit on mid-Missouri just from that regard. But But the difference between replacing the bridge and rehabbing the bridge is huge. So if they chose, if we didn't have this plan that passed and they rehab the bridge, we'd be talking about this again in 10 years. So the problem would not go away. And so the replacement of the bridge will not affect the traffic flow until they do what they call the tie-in. So when the bridge is complete and they actually move the lanes over onto the new bridge, that was that's what I was told by MoDOT. So I think this is the right thing. If we can get that federal grant, they're going to replace the bridge, and it won't be a big hit on traffic flow and delays through mid-Missouri and all that. So I'm very hopeful. Matter of fact, I'm very confident we're going to get the federal grants and get this done.
Do you know how much money it's going to cost to replace the bridge, and how much of that would have to be federal grant money?
I don't know about the federal grant part, but I've been told it was $260 to $280 million to totally replace the bridge.
Yeah, and again, since this is now connected, well, let me rephrase that. How did you feel about the federal grant being connected for the rest of the bonding plan to become active? Because that was kind of a compromise to the quote-unquote conservative caucus in the Senate, but it does seem like that's pretty beneficial to mid-Missouri, not only legislators, but mid-Missouri residents in general. Like, how did that end up coming about, and were you involved with it? Was Senator Rowden involved with it, or was that something that the conservative caucus brought up specifically?
Well, I was not involved directly in it, but I'm pretty sure Senator Rowden had a lot to do with the negotiations. But there's something that is indisputable, and if they had have rehabbed the bridge, in 10 years from now, we'd be having the same conversation, the same argument, and the cost of the bridge 10 years from now would be a lot more than it is now and next year. So I think the right thing to do is, I don't like borrowing money either, but we need to get this replaced. We've got a lot of infrastructure problems in Missouri, not just with the Rocheport Bridge, but bridges all over the state. So I think the thing to do is to borrow the money, and let's get all this done, and we can figure out a way on how to pay for it going forward.
So the reason that this bonding plan happened was because the gas tax ended up failing statewide. And I think that Governor Parson, who had been a big proponent of that, really had no other option but to do something like this.
Absolutely.
Because if he would have come back and said, let's put another gas tax on the ballot, well, it probably would have failed by even more, because voters would be like, why are you giving us this again? That's the whole will of the people thing that I'm sure you've heard from the other side of the aisle.
Yeah.
But it's still pretty evident that Missouri's roads need a lot more money than the money that's going to just fix these bridges. And these are just mainly going to bridges and not major thoroughfares. So what's next after this, especially since Missouri voters don't seem super enthused about raising taxes in order to fix transportation infrastructure?
Well, it's a good question, but, the bridge needs... The bridge at Rocheport needs to be addressed, and I-70 is just in terrible shape. The traffic is getting heavier and heavier all the time. So, but it seems like there's a lot of focus on I-70 all the time, but the rural roads, the letter roads as they're called, a lot of the roads in my district and elsewhere need a lot of attention too. So we got a lot of issues in Missouri, but there's no easy solution, but we just need to keep trying to do something to solve these problems. And, it all ties into economic development. If we have good roads and good infrastructure, it's going to draw more people to not only come through Missouri, but possibly stop and live here. And so that's what we all want, I think. Our farmers rely on good infrastructure to get their products to market, and so that it all ties into one common thing. It's just for the good of the whole society.
So we talked about bills that ended up passing in 2019. Were there any major things that you felt didn't pass this session that you're hoping come up again in 2020?
Well, probably the biggest thing for me was the eminent domain bill, because that it really is not a shot at the company trying to build the power line, but it's related to that. But
and explain what the situation is for people that don't know.
Well, there's been an attempt to move wind energy from southwest Kansas to the northeast part of the United States. And the original proposal was going to put that power line through north central Missouri, basically from just north of Kansas City up to between St. Louis and Hannibal. So they were going to use eminent domain to take private land from farmers along that route. That kind of fell apart, but a new company has emerged, and they're trying to do the same thing. And the Public Service Commission has actually given them permission to do that. So Representative Hansen filed a bill to basically block a private company from using eminent domain for the purpose of building this high transmission line. So it's not so much a shot at that company per se, but if they're allowed to, if a private company is allowed to do this and to build this power line, they can basically come to, say, my brother who has 400 acres in Howard County and say, we're going to take 50 acres of your property and put in a wind farm. So that's basically what it is. It's about property rights and things of that nature. So we got that overwhelmingly through the House. It was a bipartisan vote in favor of that bill. However, we ran out of time, and the Senate failed to get it through. So
that's an issue I admittingly haven't studied a huge amount, so I'm not going to pepper you with hundreds of questions. But one that comes to mind is, if you can't use eminent domain for like utility-related things, like power, even if it's from a renewable energy, then what would you be able to use eminent domain for?
Well,
it seems like it would be a pretty useless tool if you can't use it for something as seemingly basic as that. How would you respond to that?
That's a good point. And to be fair, there are private companies that use eminent domain, one being Ameren, the big power company on the east side of the state. But it's much different when they want to run a utility line, say to a new farm or a new business somewhere, and that does happen. But this company, it was called Invenergy, was going to use eminent domain to move this huge power line, direct current power line across Missouri. And this, from what I was told, this structure was going to be so huge. There's nothing in Missouri that exists that is this large. So it's a little different. Originally, Missouri wasn't going to get any benefit from this, so they kind of reworked their proposal and worked with the Public Utility Alliance. And the last concept was there was going to be a handful of communities, I think 29, 30 communities in Missouri that was going to get very cheap power for a short amount of time. So, but I think it comes down to property rights. The overwhelming number of farm landowners that was along this proposed route were against this. And I just thought it was a terrible concept to take farmland or property from people that did not want this across their land. And I just didn't think it was a thing to do. And a lot of my colleagues agreed with me.
So in the last few minutes that we have you on here, I want to talk a little bit about politics. Plan to run for a final term in the House, first of all?
I do, yes, sir.
What do you think that the environment is going to be for Republicans in 2020? Donald Trump is going to be on the ballot again. A lot of political observers believe that the pretty dramatic shift in rural Missouri toward Republicans has been related to Donald Trump. On the other hand, Boone County is one of the few counties in the state that voted against Donald Trump in 2016, and Democratic voters could be more energized, even in a state that's not in play like Missouri. How do you think it will be for Republicans like you running for office next year in the state legislature with Trump on the ballot?
Well, as long as my district remains pretty much as it is now, it's always going to be competitive. It requires a lot of hard work. So I don't think things are going to change a whole lot for me per se, and even for Senator Rowden. I think he's going to have a tough fight on his hand depending on what opponent he draws.
Have you heard anybody who's thinking of running
No,
against
I have
him?
not. Just rumors.
I've heard a lot of rumors, even though I've been out of the Columbia politics game for almost 10 years. But I still get rumors about who's going to run for that, and I'm not going to say them into a microphone because they're rumors. Yeah. But I would agree with you that's the 19th district is what you're talking about, which is Cooper and Boone. Probably going to be pretty competitive. I've always said, though, if they had paired Boone and Howard together, I think Stephen Weber might have won that race.
Quite possible.
Just because Howard is more historically Democratic than Cooper. And even if Rowden had won narrowly, it would probably be a 50-50 race this time around. But with Cooper, which is part of your district, Cooper is a very Republican county. So that probably not only helps Senator Rowden, but it may also be beneficial for you. I don't know how much of Cooper's in your district, though.
Very, very small amount.
Okay, so I guess it doesn't help you that much.
About 500 voters, but it's all rural people. It's going to be an interesting race, all the way from the presidential race down to our local races. So, as I said, it takes a lot of hard work and a lot of focus, and you just can't take anything for granted because. Even though, I'm just a state rep, people do watch fairly closely, and, you say the wrong thing and at the wrong function or forum, it can cost you. So,
well, especially in the Columbia media market, where if you sneeze, it's front page news.
Yeah.
And I was partially responsible for that when I worked for the Columbia Tribune. So I'm not going to apologize to you because you weren't a state rep then, but I'll apologize to everyone else. I guess the other thing too is when you go down a little bit farther down the ballot, you're going to have a governor's race. Probably between the incumbent governor, Mike Parson, assuming he announces for re-election, which I think is probable. And now with Senator Sifton bowing out of the governor's race, I think it's kind of assumed that State Auditor Galloway is going to enter. She will likely be the nominee. She's from Boone County.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how that would affect things, but I guess the caveat is she really hasn't run in a race to this level before. When she ran for auditor last year, she ran against a candidate that didn't raise a lot of money and had a lot of negatives associated with her. And I think Parsons going to be different, even though he has a record now that not everyone is happy about. So that's my rambly observation of that. But how do you think that race is going to shake out, and how do you think it'll affect down ballot?
Well, it will affect other races naturally, but the interesting thing about Boone County, at least for my district, if the very east side of my district in Columbia, I do not do well in that area. It's just it's closer to the university. It's older neighborhoods, but that doesn't say that doesn't mean it's not important. But I just try to do the best I can and be as honest as I can with people. And I think Governor Parson is the same way. So I don't know how that's going to turn out, but I think Auditor Galloway is a very nice lady. I think she's very sincere, but it'll just come down to the simple fact of what belief system people want to side with in the governor's race. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. But I think you're right, though, Jason. I think it will be between the state auditor and the sitting governor.
One last question for you. Are you planning to run for a House leadership position if you end up being reelected?
I am in the majority leader race. I have not really done a whole lot on that because I've had some family issues going on, but that's almost behind me. So I'm going to start focusing on that here pretty quick.
Do they pick that after the election or before?
Right. We're going to elect the new speaker at our caucus coming up here in a few weeks, but all the other leadership positions will be
up for grabs after the election.
And
the speaker will almost certainly be House Majority Leader Rob Vescovo.
I think so. I've not heard anybody that's emerged to take on Mr. Vescovo. He's doing a pretty good job.
He may become I don't remember the last time someone from Jefferson County was speaker. We'll have to go back. We'll have to go look at all those composites and look at the county under all the speakers' names, some of which who probably had long beards or handlebar mustaches. And Majority Leader Vescovo has neither. Well, Representative, thank you so much for coming here today. For all of our stories, STLpublicradio.org. You can follow me on Twitter at Rosenbaum. How do people follow you on Twitter? Is it like Chuck Basye 47 or something like that?
Yeah, at Chuck Basye 47.
So until next time, so long.